Okay, so I'm gonna make a bold claim here. If you're using TypeScript, then you should probably know or even use Zod, because it does what TypeScript can't in the way that it validates types at runtime, which you can't do with TypeScript, but you should definitely be able to do. So let's take a look at it. Okay, so as a little example, I've made a little app right here that basically just makes a mock fetch request that returns a random object as a user basically. And we're gonna manipulate it a bit and check if the types are valid using Zod. So as you can see here, we basically get a random value and return any, because we of course don't know what the type is, given that this is supposed to be a mocked network request. And depending on what our random value is, we return a different object. And this way we will simulate a server that doesn't behave as you expect it to, and sometimes returns correct objects, but sometimes doesn't. And to get started, we're now gonna first of all npm install Zod, and then we can actually start already. So first of all, we're gonna import Z from Zod. So to get started, we're first of all going to create a user, which is a z.object. So basically just a Zod object. And this object now takes an object, of course. And here we will now define what a user looks like. So as you can see down below, it of course will have a username, which will be a z.string. You unfortunately can't use proper TypeScript types, but that will be an advantage as well, which you're going to see soon. And then we're also going to say we want an ID. And that ID is of course going to be a z.number. But we can be even more specific here than TypeScript would allow us to be, because we can actually go ahead and say .int.non-negative. So we can actually do more precise checks than we could using TypeScript, which is kind of awesome. But now we might want to get a type out of this as well, because right now we only have a user object that exists in runtime, but we don't have a TypeScript type. But that's actually quite easy. We can now just say type user equals z.infer type of user. And now our user has a username string and an ID number, which we can now use inside of our React. Because down here we currently have a use state that uses any, which we can now turn into a user. And we can of course also use it down here to get rid of any implicit any errors or stuff like that. But as you can see, we currently aren't validating that any of these types are right, because we don't have any IDs or whatever in here. But if we check our Chrome, we can see that everything is still running, which is basically the main issue with TypeScript. It can't check in runtime, and because this is an any type, it can't know what will happen. So it just assumes everything will be alright and can't know any better. So what we can do in our use effect that basically makes this mock fetch and then sets the user is we can say const u equals user dot parse new user. And what this will do is it will take in anything, any type of object, check is this a user, and if so, it will return a user. If not, it will throw an error. So we can basically say, if we get in here, then we will know this is a proper user object, and we can set our user to u. So now let's just head back to Chrome, reload, and we can see our whole site is blank. So if we just take a look at our console, we can see Zod error, invalid type, expected number, received undefined, path ID. So it actually tells us what went wrong and how we can fix it basically. So now let's just go in here and add this ID everywhere. So ID 1, and let's also break it sometimes. So ID -1 and also an ID 1.1 to just check what will happen right here. So let's reload. We can see we got a float this time, not an integer, so the 1.1. Let's reload again, same error. And this time we got the -1 because it says number must be greater or equal to 0. So this check works absolutely awesomely. So let's just fix this up real quick so that this doesn't throw us any more errors. And let's move on by doing something a bit more advanced that might actually be useful for you. So we're going to add an email in here, and that will of course be a z.string. And we can actually tell it that this should also be an email. And what's even cooler is we can actually go into any of these functions and add an object as a parameter that has a message. And that message will basically be our error message. So if Zod throws an error, then we can actually access this message to basically display something if we wanted to inside of a try catch, for example. Here we can just say invalid email address. Now let's just take a look at Chrome, reload, and we can see currently we don't get this message because we just didn't give in anything at all. So it isn't even a string. So we of course didn't even get to that email bit. But if we just were to add an email in here, let's say A, so this isn't a proper email, but all the others will be. Head back to Chrome, reload, we can see message invalid email address. And something that you'll probably also see is that all these other emails aren't valid as well because A isn't a valid domain ending. So you of course will need to be careful with keeping this up to date because sometimes the domain endings will change. But for our use case, this is absolutely fine right now. So we can just change all of these, reload, and now we can see if we reload, all of these values change and everything still looks awesomely. Let's just do one more thing, which is that we actually want to provide a user type. So type, and here we can now use literals actually. So like TypeScript would allow you to do a literal. So type A equals test or test2. We can actually also do this in Zod. So to do that, we're actually gonna create a new Zod type. So const user type equals z.literal. And here we'll just say one of the types is admin. And then using or, we can provide another one. So z.literal again. And here we will provide something like customer. And now we can just say the type in here is going to be a user type. Now if we look into our user, we can see type is admin or customer, username is string, ID is number, and email is also a string. Now we can go ahead and say type of this guy is he's an admin. Here we've got a customer. And down here, we've got a type of ABC, which doesn't exist. So if we just reload, we can see invalid input, Zod error, invalid literal value expected customer. Because ABC, of course, wasn't what we needed. But we could, of course, also go ahead and say dot optional and just remove this type right here. And now if we get to b@a.com with ID 3, we can see that there's no error because our type is actually optional. So as you can see, the type attribute on our user is now optional, so it can be undefined. And our mock fetch user function can now be validated in any way we want, because for something like a network request over REST, you just don't have any type safety. And now you can have using something like Zod, which will just validate all your inputs and make sure that everything will behave the way you intended to, which is just awesome. But of course, all of this Zod magic doesn't help you if you aren't using TypeScript properly. So how about you check out this video where I'll show you how to use React with TypeScript properly. So have a good one and check it out.